everybody, it's the Moo Cow here. I'm back here in Moo Cow Studios because we are going to review a movie. It's actually a couple days before the big Hurricane Florence, so I'm kind of wearing my cow do-rag because I had to go back to the studio and make sure that all our electronics and stuff were covered up, and I rescued some movies and such, and had to save this guy. Can't have Continuity Monkey drowning in the possible flood. We don't know what's going to happen with it, so I just decided to take him to higher ground. In the meantime, I checked out a movie, and this time it is The Crimson Cult, also known as The Curse of the Crimson Altar. This is a movie that was made in 1968 by Tygon Films, which is a British film company that made some horror movies back in the late 60s and early 70s. They were kind of like a later version of Hammer films. They did a lot of those kind of movies. And this particular movie is actually kind of very similarly based to, if you guys are familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's Dream of the Witch House, it's very similar to that. Not quite as interesting, unfortunately, but it has a really, really good cast, and that's really why I picked up the movie in the first place. So we've got Boris Karloff, who's already a legend in the horror industry. You got Christopher Lee, who at the time was a big guy with all the Hammer films, and of course would become a legend in his own right in horror films. And you've got the equally legendary and always wonderful Barbara Steele playing a small role. And you've got Michael Gow, who's in a lot of different stuff, and just all kinds of different people. So I was kind of expecting this to be sort of a more fun, more interesting film. I'd seen it a long time ago, back when I was a kid, but I hadn't seen it in a long time. So I thought I'd buy it when I saw it. I got it off of Amazon, had it mailed to me, and thought I'd pop it in, review it, and check it out. And yeah, unfortunately, it's not as interesting as I would have liked it to have been, considering the cast. But so basically what happens is you've got this guy, Robert Manning, who's played by Mark Eden, who did a lot of British TV. He has a brother named Peter Manning. They're both sort of antique dealers, and Peter goes missing because he's gone down to this creepy old house someplace in England that is owned by Christopher Lee's character, Morley. And he gets himself involved with something. You're not really quite sure. You're sort of shown in the beginning this sort of strange, esoteric, sort of bizarre witch thing that's going on. We're not really sure. There's a bunch of half-naked people whipping each other and just doing weird stuff. And Barbara Steele's got this big goat's horn, and she's painted blue. And you're like, what the fuck? Anyway, that comes into play later. So basically, he's there, and he signs his name in a book, which you should never do, but he does it anyway, and after that, he goes missing. So his brother ends up getting a package, and it's this big box, and it's got some silver stuff in there, and it's got what they're calling a false bodkin, so it's spring-loaded, so when you stab somebody, then the thing actually goes in there, and there's a letter. And so Robert Manning says, well, this guy supposed to have been here by now. He said he was here. Here's the address. So he decides to go down and look for his brother down at that creepy old place. And that's when all the trouble starts. So he gets there, and there's this, I guess, their version, Tygon's version of a swinging 60s party, where there are a bunch of ne'er-do-well younger kids out there drinking heavily, and there's some weird rock and roll being played, and there are people sort of painting each other in garish colors, and I guess, it's one of those things this is what conservative people think that the crazy swinging 60s were all about. It wasn't particularly crazy, yeah. But in any event, he ends up meeting Morley's niece, Eve, who's played by the very lovely Virginia Weatherall. She's actually very pretty, and she actually shows up in a number of different movies later on, too. A couple of Hammer things, and I know she was in some British TV later on. And apparently she's actually, I believe she's the stage actress in Clockwork Orange, the one who helps, what's-his-face sort of go through his whole thing where he figures that he can't hurt anybody anymore, and she's basically topless. Well, that's kind of like her thing. She gets a little topless in this film too, so that's the other reason why I decided to sort of review this one outside of Indie Film Cafe. But in any event, so he meets her there, and she's not really sure what's going on. She introduces him to her uncle, who's played by Christopher Lee, and who both, in turn, introduce him further onto Professor Marsh, who's played by, yay, Boris Karloff. Now, Boris Karloff at this point was in his 80s. His health was failing. This is one of his last roles, and, you can kind of tell. I mean, he does his best, but he's kind of in a wheelchair. His character's in a wheelchair, and he's not particularly full of life. And as a matter of fact, there are a number of cases where, it doesn't look like he could really walk around very much. So he was definitely winding down in his career. So Marsh is there to sort of provide lots of background information because he's a witchcraft expert, as you happen to be. And he gives the guy lots of brandy and lots of talk, and is pretty much there to sort of act as exposition for the film. And then there's this guy, Elder, who is kind of I guess a manservant. He is the manservant for Christopher Lee's character and is played by Michael Gow, who's been in a whole bunch of movies, some Shakespeare films, all kinds of different stuff. I think people will remember him as being in some of the early or later 80s Batman films. You'll recognize him as soon as you see him. He's been one of those guys. He's a great character actor who's been around forever. So he plays kind of a touched-in-the-head manservant who is, on the one hand, trying to warn Robert Manning about what's going on. On the other hand, he's tied to Barbara Steele's character, and Barbara Steele's character is Lavinia. So basically the story is Lavinia is a witch who was burned by the people in the village there that the building belongs to, the house belongs to, back in 1652. And supposedly she gets burned even though she demands she's innocent, but she ends up cursing everybody because that's what innocent people do when they're burned for witchcraft. So her witchly ghost comes back, and she's trying to kill all the descendants because that's who she's cursed. Everybody who was involved in that. And as it turns out, the Mannings were actually there, and it was a Manning who was the primary person who accused Lavinia of being a witch. So that's why when Peter Manning shows up, he's never allowed to escape, and then Robert Manning comes, and they do everything they can to try and trap him there, and all kinds of fun and frolics happen since. And there's a number of different sort of psychedelic dreams that he has that gives him clues. There's some hidden rooms. There's these odd little sort of witch sort of setups that are very strange. The dream sequences have this kind of strange kaleidoscopy kind of look to them, and it's kind of irritating actually after a while. They're not particularly convincing. And they've got people sort of running around in different sort of emblems of witchcraft. You've got the guy with the big horns, you've got the black goat, you've got a chicken getting killed, and people writing their names in a giant book with blood, and different things like that. And as it turns out, it's Morley himself, played by Christopher Lee, who is actually trying to continue on with Lavinia's lineage, who's trying to track down all of the descendants and kill them. So actually, it's not that dissimilar from another movie from 1960 called Horror Hotel, also known as City of the Dead, which coincidentally also happened to star Christopher Lee in one of his early films. Unfortunately, that particular film does this sort of thing much, much better. And my hope is that I get to do another podcast that I want to call Forgotten Horror Classics, because City of the Dead is just a beautifully shot, really, really cool film that I think people really need to check out. I know it's kind of floating out there in public domain land, but you should be able to see that, a decent copy of that, and I think you would enjoy that much better than this particular film. In this particular film, the acting was pretty good. With the cast like this, you would have expected to be good. It's kind of slow. Some of the things that you see, you're not quite buying. they have a real nice setup. They have some nice homes. Even though Morley decides the way to get out of it is to sort of set his own place on fire, which is kind of weird. And then the ending is just weird, where he's kind of at the top of the burning building, and people are looking at him. You expect him to either jump or burn up or something, and then he kind of sort of suddenly turns into Lavinia, maybe, kind of, sort of, and she kind of looks at everybody, and you expect something, and then just nothing. It just sort of ends. So the acting is pretty good. I don't know that Mark Eden really holds a candle to Christopher Lee, well, who's never given a bad performance in his career, or to even an aged Boris Karloff, frankly. He's kind of I don't want to say a lightweight, but he just doesn't command the film, and so that's problematic. And then the director himself, Vernon Sewell, there really isn't that much tension. It's just kind of dull, frankly. It kind of creeps along. There should be a lot more. There should be things going on. There should be a lot creepier, and it's just kind of not. So in a way, it's sort of disappointing. On the other hand, it's also kind of a little time capsule if you really sort of dig the old late 60s style of these kind of movies. It's like a Hammer movie, only a later one. Honestly, these sort of old witchy kind of haunted house, vampire-y kind of movies were kind of long in the tooth by the time the late 60s came around. So quality-wise, they just don't really hold up to some of the earlier films, and that's one of the problems here. Having Boris Karloff is really, really a good thing, but like I said, he was older at this point. He was in the last stages of his career, and he was in failing health, and you could tell. He just wasn't very dynamic, and there wasn't a lot of life to him. And even though he still has the great Karloff voice, and he can still play a decent character, and he can still seem convincing, there's nothing wrong with his performance. It's just seeing him kind of old and frail is kind of depressing a little bit. To see someone of that stature sort of winding down his career, you would have liked to have seen him in something a little better quality. The writing is such that, there's a few things that I didn't particularly care for, like, at one point Manning manages to find the identity bracelet of his brother, just happens to be there. Well, that's convenient, so that's what convinces him. There are a few other things like that. Certainly the party scenes were not particularly convincing. I didn't think they were particularly swinging. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I know at one point they have the sort of like the village there has a commemoration of the burning of Lavinia. So they have like this big Guy Fawkes kind of thing where they burn the witch in effigy, and they set off a whole bunch of fireworks, and everybody in the village kind of gets together and they all celebrate it. I don't know if there's really that much to celebrate, but I guess it's one of those things where it's tradition, so they just do it, and they don't really have much else to do. And there's a couple of red herrings I didn't particularly care for. At one point, Robert Manning, who's Mark Eden's character, is going through the woods. He's just left the house, and he's going down to the village because he's trying to figure out what's going on with my brother. Was he here? Was he not? And he goes through the woods, and he nearly gets shot by Professor Marsh's butler. There's really no reason for that scene whatsoever, other than to sort of make it look like maybe the butler and or Professor Marsh are in on it, and they're not. So I don't understand why that's in there, other than to just be a red herring. The movie doesn't really need a red herring. I was kind of annoyed by that, especially because, as it turns out, Marsh is one of the guys who helps solve things in the end, which is another thing, because he's got to get up these stairs all the way to the top of because the witch house, or the witch room, is in the top of the top of this massive building. So, he's in a wheelchair most of the time. So how the hell did he get up there? In fact, not only is he up there, but he's on his feet, and he's the guy that shoots Christopher Lee's character in the hand, making him drop his knife, which is another old chestnut in movies. I mean, nobody has that kind of aim where you can just, wing somebody in the hand and make them drop a weapon. It's kind of goofy. Sometimes you can forgive that sort of a thing. There's just a few too many of those contrivances, and that kind of spoiled the film for me. The buildings that they were shot in were very particularly creepy. The settings were decent. like I said, the acting for the most part was pretty good. Poor Michael Gow, his role is pretty well underwritten. He could have definitely put a little bit more thought into that. Mark Eden's character is kind of a womanizing dick. I guess that was the thing back in the 60s. He just sort of assumes that Eve is into him, so he's definitely kind of trying to force his way into her pants pretty much from the moment he meets her, which, it's one thing to think about it. It's another thing to sort of do that and try to invite yourself into her room all the time. That was a little creepy and a little pushy and a little unnecessary. But 1968, you're trying to play for the drive-in crowd. So in addition to horror, you want to mix a little sex in there because that's what you did back then. And that's kind of her role there, is to sort of, have a little soft porn, topless stuff. And that's what she's there. Not a bad thing, not judging. She looks great. Virginia Weatherall looked really, really great back then. It just would have been, it would have been a decent movie. It didn't have it. Wasn't really that necessary. I will say that as far as her acting goes, she's pretty good. You definitely feel like you feel something for her, and as it turns out, she's kind of an innocent person in this. Just kind of gets caught up, and is one of the people who was going to get killed towards the end. So if you don't want to hear any spoilers, you probably should turn this off now. But overall, I'm glad I bought the disc. I'm glad I checked it out. I remember seeing this when I was a kid, just, monster movie, creature double features of the past. And I thought, at the time, creepy old movie, Boris Karloff, Christopher Lee, always a good thing. Now seeing it maybe 20, 25 years later, maybe not so much, but, I added to the collection. So Moody and I have been sort of going over our individual movie review videos and sort of rating them on a 1 to 5 star basis. So I'll continue that as well. So 1 to 5, I would say that Curse of the Crimson Altar or Crimson Cult, probably 2 stars. A little disappointing. I was kind of hoping for a 3, honestly. Not a terrible film, not a bad film. Disappointing film, I think. Slightly disappointing. Could have been better. The part of that is the director, in my opinion. I think there were some unnecessary scenes and some unnecessary contrivances that, a tighter director would have been able to solve. But overall, it was okay. If you're gonna, stay at home and wait out a storm and hope that you're not gonna get, the weather's not gonna, knock out your power or something, you got nothing else better to do, it's not a bad thing to throw on. There are other movies. Now, in particular, Tygon Films, who Sewell directed this for, they actually made some decent movies in the late 60s and early 70s. Witchfinder General was probably the one that is most famous for them. It's actually a pretty good film. They also did Blood on Satan's Claw, which was actually pretty good as well. And then in the early 70s, they did one called The Creeping Flesh that I saw that was pretty good. So they actually had some decent films. They weren't quite up there with Hammer or Amicus or some of the other ones, but they were kind of in that neighborhood. And they had a decent run of some decent films. And I believe that there is I think Anchor Bay put out a retrospective DVD set that has like maybe 8 or 10 of the Tygon film. So if that's the sort of thing you want to check out, and I wouldn't mind getting my hooves on that too, because that's, like I said, it's kind of a grab bag of some decent films. But I think you can order that off of Amazon. So if you want to check that out. So 2 out of 5, that's not too bad. A little disappointing. As I've said, Christopher Lee has never given a bad performance as far as I'm concerned in his career. So if you want to check him out in this particular film, this is good. It's a little bit of a downer as far as Boris Karloff is concerned. I have to say that. But otherwise, I'd say this is not a bad little film to check out. It's kind of a late 60s curio, so to speak. It certainly could have been a lot better, but it's not terrible either. So check it out. I'm sure you can find it online at Amazon.com or a couple other places, wherever you buy your movies. And okay, so that's about it for today. There weren't really any continuity errors. but I thought I'd squeak my monkey for you guys anyway because that's always fun. Plus, now that he's safe from the storm, he's a much happier monkey.